I am Maya, 34, and my father's anniversary dinner ended when he shattered a wine glass against the mahogany baseboard of the house I secretly bought for him. 30 relatives watched in frozen silence as coffee splashed my knuckles and Robert roared, "This house was always mine. Get out before I call the police." His face was a map of bloodshot veins, while my daughter huddled on the rug, clutching a tattered rabbit. I didn't blink. I simply wiped the liquid from my skin with a linen napkin. "Okay, Robert, leaving now." He thought he was evicting a daughter, but he didn't know about the encrypted folder that would turn his world gray 2 weeks later. I didn't blink or raise my voice. I simply took a linen napkin and slowly wiped the dark liquid from my skin. Looking directly into his bloodshot eyes, I whispered 7 words that changed everything. "Okay, Robert, we are leaving right now." I picked up Chloe, who was shaking silently, and walked past my mother's tearful, downcast gaze without grabbing a single suitcase. I only needed my car keys and the knowledge of a specific digital folder waiting in my encrypted cloud. But before I tell you who knocked on that door 2 weeks later and turned his world gray, I need to take you back to the day I saved this family. Standing in that dimly lit hotel hallway at 11:45 p.m., I watched Chloe finally drift into a restless sleep, her small fingers still locked around Mr. Button's matted fur. If you have ever been forced to choose between your blood and your peace, hit that like button and subscribe, because you need to understand how deep this betrayal truly goes. My father's scream still vibrated in my marrow, but my mind was already calculating the square footage of the life I had just abandoned. To understand why I didn't fight back that night, you have to see the $420,000 wire transfer I authorized 4 years ago. It was the Tuesday I decided to buy a lie for them. I remember the summer of 2004 with a clarity that still stings my eyes when I close them. I was 12 years old and had spent 10 months scrubbing neighbors' porches and delivering local newspapers to save exactly $200. My goal was a blue Schwinn bicycle with silver fenders that sat in the window of Miller's Hardware on Oak Street. One Tuesday evening, I came home to find my ceramic piggy bank shattered on the kitchen tile, its contents gone. Robert didn't even look up from his beer when he told me he'd borrowed it for an overdue electric bill. When I asked when I'd get it back, he called me selfish. Growing up in that Victorian house on Elm Drive felt like living inside a pressure cooker where the valve was permanently stuck. Robert was a retired contractor who measured his worth by the decibels of his own voice, often mistaking volume for actual authority. Every floorboard that creaked under my feet seemed to trigger a lecture about the sacrifices he made, though his business ledgers told a far different story of mismanagement and pride. My mother, Elena, moved through the hallways like a ghost, smoothing over the jagged edges of his temper with forced smiles and silence. I learned early on that my only survival strategy was to be methodical, observant, and exceptionally quiet. In May 2014, I graduated at the very top of my class with a degree in architectural project management. We went to a steakhouse downtown where the bill came to exactly $248, a sum I paid secretly before we even sat down. Throughout the entire dinner, Robert held court, telling my aunts and uncles that my intellect was merely a byproduct of his superior construction genes. He never mentioned the 3 part-time jobs I worked or the nights I spent sleeping on drafting tables to avoid student loans. He took my success, wrapped it in his ego, and presented it to the world as his own personal achievement. By the time I turned 28, I was managing multi-million-dollar projects across the state, tracking every nail and hour with surgical precision. Meanwhile, my younger brother, Lucas, became the family's permanent golden boy, a title he earned by simply existing and nodding whenever Robert spoke. Lucas lived in a sleek downtown condo that I helped down pay with $60,000 of my hard-earned savings, yet he never once said thank you. He was the perfect audience for Robert's delusions, always siding with the patriarch to ensure his monthly allowance remained untouched. I was the architect of their comfort, yet I was treated like a temporary contractor in my own family tree. The only person who saw the truth was Grandma Rose, my mother's mother, who lived in a small room filled with the scent of dried lavender and old paper. In July 2020, as she lay on her deathbed at Mercy Hospital, she pulled me close with a strength that defied her frail frame. Her voice was a dry whisper that felt like a secret map being handed to a prisoner. "He will forget your kindness, Maya," she warned, her eyes locking onto mine with terrifying clarity. "Record the ink, not the words." She pressed a small, cold brass key into my palm, a key that would eventually lead me to the truth. Everything changed on a Tuesday in October, 4 years ago, when I found my mother weeping over a stack of certified mail on the kitchen island. The bank was officially foreclosing on the family home due to Robert's investments turning into a black hole of debt totaling $380,000. The prideful man who had built half the town was about to be tossed onto the street by the very system he claimed to master. He sat in his leather recliner, staring at a blank television screen, refusing to acknowledge the catastrophe. I realized then that if I didn't act, my parents would lose everything they had. On November 12th, I sat at my desk and authorized a wire transfer of exactly $420,000 to save the house. It was the entirety of my inheritance from Grandma Rose and years of my own corporate bonuses, gone in a single digital heartbeat. I bought the house outright, clearing the debt and putting the deed solely in my name to ensure it could never be leveraged again. At the time, I told myself it was an act of love, a way to provide stability for my aging parents. I didn't realize I was actually buying a front row seat to my own systematic emotional execution. We sat in the dim light of the dining room that evening to discuss the new living arrangements. I drafted a simple occupancy agreement, but Robert waved it away with a hand that smelled of expensive bourbon and old sawdust. He insisted on a verbal agreement between family, claiming that my legal paperwork was an insult to his honor as a father. Within 6 months, his narrative shifted with the speed of a summer storm. He began telling neighbors that I was merely managing his property. He twisted my financial salvation into his own personal triumph, conveniently forgetting who actually signed the checks that kept the roof over his head. For the next 3 years, I lived in a state of suspended reality, paying every property tax bill and utility invoice from my personal account. Every time a repair was needed, whether it was the $1,200 water heater or the new roof, Robert would direct the workmen as if he were paying them. I watched from the shadows of my home office, documenting every cent while he performed the role of the successful patriarch for the benefit of the neighbors. My mother would catch my eye sometimes, a flicker of guilt crossing her face, before she looked down at her knitting and returned to her silent, complicit world. When my daughter Chloe was born 6 years ago, the house felt even more crowded with the weight of Robert's ego and my growing resentment. She became my anchor, a small girl who found comfort in a tattered stuffed rabbit she named Mr. Buttons, which she carried everywhere like a shield. I wanted her to grow up with a sense of family, but instead she witnessed the subtle ways her grandfather diminished her mother every single day. Robert would tell her stories of how he built our empire, never mentioning that his only contribution was the noise he made while others did the actual work. I started saving every receipt in a folder. Exactly 1 year ago, during a humid Sunday lunch, Robert cornered me in the kitchen while my mother was clearing the plates. He demanded that I put Lucas on the deed of the house just in case something happened to me, claiming it was for family unity. The pressure was immense, with my mother whispering about keeping the peace and Lucas sitting at the table, eyes glued to his expensive smartphone. I felt the familiar walls of guilt closing in, but Grandma Rose's dying words echoed in my mind like a warning bell. I refused, citing tax complications I knew he wouldn't understand, and saw the first spark of real hatred. That was the night Robert first used the phrase that would eventually become the epitaph of our relationship and the fuel for my exit. He stood over me, his shadow stretching long across the mahogany table, and hissed, "You owe this family everything you are, Maya." He truly believed that my career, my wealth, and even my daughter were all extensions of his own greatness, debts that could never be repaid. According to his twisted logic, my $420,000 investment was just a down payment on the life he gave me. I realized then that there was no amount of money or kindness that could ever satisfy a man who saw himself as a god. The atmosphere in the house turned cold and clinical after that confrontation, as if the very air were being rationed. Robert stopped speaking to me directly, choosing instead to bark orders at the gardener or complain loudly to my mother about my disrespectful attitude. I became a ghost in the Victorian hallways, a senior architectural project manager who could organize a 50-story skyscraper but couldn't find peace in her own kitchen. I watched Chloe clutching Mr. Buttons tighter during dinner, her wide eyes darting between the adults as the tension thickened like smog. I knew the breaking point was coming, and I began the quiet process of preparing the digital ground for the inevitable explosion. My methodical nature, the very trait Robert mocked as boring, became my greatest weapon as I began to compile the final evidence of his deception. I spent my late nights scanning every bank statement from the last 4 years and recording the video of him admitting I bought the house. I was no longer the little girl whose $200 bike savings were stolen. I was a professional builder who knew that every structure needs a solid foundation. Robert thought he was the king of a castle, but he was actually a tenant in a house of cards I had built for him. I just needed one more night to prove who truly owned the dirt. The humidity in the dining room was thick enough to taste, a mixture of expensive perfume and the cloying scent of the 3-tiered anniversary cake that cost me exactly $640. 30 of our closest relatives were laughing, their voices bouncing off the walls I had painted myself 2 summers ago. I stood near the mahogany sideboard, watching Robert drain his 4th glass of 18-year-old scotch, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. When I casually mentioned my plan to convert the dusty attic into a modern home office by September, the laughter died instantly. Robert's fork hit his china plate with a sharp metallic clatter that felt like a starting pistol. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Chloe looked up from the rug, her small fingers twisting Mr. Button's frayed left ear as she tilted her head in genuine confusion. "Mommy," she whispered into the quiet room, "why does Grandpa say this is his house if you're the one who pays the man in the green truck every Friday?" I saw the precise moment Robert's pride shattered. It was a physical transformation that turned his eyes into dark, hollow pits. He didn't use words at first. He simply grabbed his crystal wine glass and hurled it with terrifying force. The glass exploded against the white baseboard just inches from Chloe's yellow Sunday dress, sending jagged shards skittering across the hardwood floor I had refinished in 2021. Robert surged to his feet, his chair screeching back with a sound like grinding bone, and pointed a trembling finger toward the front door. "This house was always mine," he roared, his voice cracking with a lifetime of unearned entitlement and fermented rage. "Get out before I call the police on you." 30 relatives sat like statues, their eyes fixed on their plates, while my mother, Elena, wept silently into her lace napkin. I felt Chloe's cold, shaking hand. I didn't scream, and I didn't cry. Instead, I felt a strange clinical clarity wash over my entire body as I looked at my father. I reached down, picked up Chloe and her rabbit, and felt the dampness of her tears against my shoulder, yet my own heart stayed steady. "Okay, Robert," I said, my voice cutting through the room with the precision of a surgical blade. "We are leaving right now." 7 words were all it took to end 34 years of silence. I walked out into the cool 8:45 p.m. air, drove straight to the Marriott, and began drafting an email to Mr. Henderson. At 9:15 a.m. the next morning, I stood in the sterile, air-conditioned silence of the First National Bank, holding the small brass key Grandma Rose had pressed into my palm years ago. My fingers traced the cold, jagged edges of the metal, a physical manifestation of her final warning to record the ink rather than the fleeting words of prideful men. The teller led me to the vault, a subterranean fortress of steel and secrets that smelled of old paper and ancient copper. When the heavy door of box 402 clicked open, I found the blue binder waiting there like a dormant weapon. Inside lay the original notarized occupancy agreement Robert signed in 2020, then promptly forgot. I didn't call a friend, I called Mr. Henderson, a man whose reputation for legal brutality was only matched by his 30-year rivalry with my father. His office on the 24th floor overlooked the city, a glass cage filled with leather-bound books and the sharp scent of expensive espresso. Henderson didn't offer me tea or platitudes about family unity. He simply adjusted his silver spectacles and began scanning the $420,000 wire transfer receipt I placed on his mahogany desk. He knew every bridge Robert had burned in this town, every contractor he had cheated, and every lie he had ever told to maintain his status. He smiled with a cold, predatory, and surgical precision. We spent exactly 3 hours and 42 minutes going through the digital fortress I had built since 2020. Every property tax receipt, every $1,200 water heater invoice, and even the $6,000 roof repair bill were laid out in chronological order. The centerpiece was the video I recorded on a humid Tuesday evening 2 years ago, where Robert clearly stated that I was the sole owner of the Elm Drive property. He had been drinking bourbon and felt expansive, bragging about how he had allowed me to save him, unaware that his vanity was being encoded into a permanent legal confession. Henderson nodded as the footage played, his pen scratching rhythmically against a yellow legal pad. At exactly 2 RPM on Thursday, a professional process server pulled into the driveway of the Victorian house I legally owned. I watched the live feed from my doorbell camera as the man in the charcoal suit handed my father the thick white envelope containing the formal 30-day notice to quit. Robert's face shifted from confused arrogance to a pale, ashen gray as he read the first 3 lines of the document. There were no shouts recorded by the microphone, only the heavy, rhythmic thud of his front door closing against a reality he couldn't bully into submission. He was no longer the patriarch of an empire. He was officially a tenant who had overstayed his welcome. The second envelope was even heavier, containing the civil lawsuit for unjust enrichment that Mr. Henderson had drafted with terrifying speed. We calculated the fair market rent for that house over the last 48 months, totaling exactly $86,400. Robert had lived for free while I paid the $420,000 mortgage, and now the law was asking for a precise accounting of his entitlement. Every dinner he hosted and every bottle of scotch he bought with his Social Security check was now being weighed against the debt he owed his own daughter. The man who claimed I owed him everything I am was suddenly facing a bill he could never hope to pay. Reputation is a fragile structure, and I watched Robert's collapse in real time as the truth rippled through our 30 extended relatives. I sent a single, blind copy email to everyone who had sat at that anniversary dinner, containing nothing but the deed to the house and the occupancy agreement. Within 6 hours, the family group chat fell silent, replaced by private messages of shock and whispered apologies from aunts who had previously judged my coldness. The image of the successful self-made contractor was replaced by the reality of a man living on his daughter's charity while screaming for her to get out. The silence from the community was louder than any of his previous drunken roars. My mother, Elena, called 17 times that afternoon, but I let each vibration die on the hotel nightstand without a second thought. She had watched me sign the checks and knew the price of our survival. Yet she chose the comfort of her silence over the protection of her child. My brother Lucas found his own condo's locks changed after I contacted the building management to revoke my co-signer status, a move that immediately triggered a demand for his full security deposit. He had spent years riding the wake of my father's ego, and now he was drowning in the cold water of his own lack of responsibility. The golden boy was finally seeing his own reflection. By 11 p.m. on the 14th day, I sat in my hotel room, the blue light of my laptop illuminating the digital file titled The End of the Lie. I had blocked every number, ignored every emotional plea, and let the legal servers do the talking for me. Chloe was asleep next to me, her breathing slow and rhythmic as she clutched Mr. Buttons, finally safe from the vibrations of a house built on rage. I wasn't acting out of vengeance. I was performing a structural renovation on my own life, removing the rotting beams that threatened to collapse on us. For the first time in 34 years, the silence in the room felt like a beautiful peace. The scent of rosemary chicken and roasted potatoes drifted from the stainless steel oven, filling my new 2-bedroom apartment with a warmth that had nothing to do with a thermostat. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, a soft, relentless April rain streaked the glass, blurring the city lights into a palette of neon amber and soft violet. I sat on the linen sofa, cradling a mug of Earl Grey tea that cost exactly $4 a box, but tasted like absolute freedom. There were no heavy Victorian shadows here, no echoes of slamming doors, and no lingering scent of stale bourbon and unearned pride. I had traded a $420,000 nightmare for a 1,200 square foot sanctuary where every single brick belonged to my peace. In the corner of the living room, Chloe lay fast asleep on a plush cream rug, her breathing a slow, rhythmic lullaby that anchored my soul. She was still wearing her favorite pajamas, and tucked securely under her chin was Mr. Buttons, his matted fur finally clean and his missing eye replaced with a sturdy silver button. He no longer looked like a shield for a terrified child. He looked like a decorated veteran of a war we had finally won together. Beside her sat the brand-new handcrafted wooden dollhouse I bought her last Tuesday for exactly $300. She had placed a tiny wooden sign over the front door that simply read, "Only kind people live here," a child's simple manifesto. I looked at the digital clock on the wall, which clicked silently to 7:42 p.m., reflecting on the 21 days since I walked out of that anniversary dinner. Blood makes you related by a roll of the genetic dice, but I finally understood that only loyalty and respect make you a true family. For 34 years, I lived under the suffocating weight of my father's favorite weapon, the phrase he used to keep me small and compliant. He used to hiss, "You owe this family everything you are," whenever I tried to claim my own space or my own success. Now, as I watched the rain wash the city clean, I realized that I actually owed that toxic legacy something else, my final departure. The legal battle over the Elm Drive property would continue for months in a sterile courtroom, but my internal war ended the moment I turned that key. I didn't lose a childhood home. I finally evicted the ghosts of manipulation and the rot of entitlement that had been choking my growth for decades. Sometimes the only way to save a family tree is to cut off the jagged branches that are trying to choke your sunlight. I took a long, slow sip of my tea, feeling the quiet strength of a woman who no longer needed to buy love with a wire transfer. My life was finally my own design, built on a foundation of truth that no bully could demolish. If you are listening to this and you feel that familiar, cold knot in your stomach because you are the one holding your family together while they tear you apart, please listen closely to my voice. You are not a villain for choosing your own sanity over a legacy built on lies. And you are certainly not selfish for finally protecting the peace you worked so hard to build with your own 2 hands. We are often taught that blood is an unbreakable contract, but I have learned that true family is earned through respect, not just shared DNA or a name on a birth certificate. You deserve a sanctuary that doesn't require you to constantly shrink yourself just to keep others feeling big. Protecting your peace is the most architectural act you will ever perform, and it starts by realizing that you don't owe anyone your soul as a down payment for their approval. I want to know if you have ever been the one saving people who only ended up biting the hand that fed them, or if you've finally found the strength to walk away from a house of cards. Tell me your story in the comments below, because your voice matters and you aren't alone in this fight for a life that actually feels like home. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to join our growing community of survivors today.